Hello and welcome to One Piece of Insight. In today's video, I will be talking through one of my strategies for finding safer cards to buy while we're enduring this downturn in the market. I think it's important to start by talking about what I think is actually happening in the market. So we saw this wild run up in prices for 3 months where people were trying to figure out sort of what is the maximum price people are willing to pay for these specific cards. And I think one of the reasons this happened is because this is a relatively new game. The game is expanding pretty quickly. We didn't have a great sense of what the top should look like for these individual cards. So we kept testing the top over and over and over again until finally pushback occurred, and then people weren't willing to pay the prices that they were set at, and then that caused the market to go down. Now, on the other side, as we're falling in prices, we're trying to figure out what is the actual floor for these cards? What is the minimum they should be worth before people decide not to sell and just decide to keep them themselves, expecting they're going to go up in the future? And while we do have more data on this side to help understand what the floor should be, we still don't have a great sense for most cards because we're assuming that the market has actually grown. So we can't just look at what prices were a year ago and say, well, if prices were down a year ago or 6 months ago, that's what the card should be worth. I genuinely believe that the market for this game has grown, and that means that the previous floor should no longer be the current floor. But all we can really say for sure is that what these prices should be worth is somewhere between their previous low and their previous high. So with that, the question becomes, how do we know what price to pay or what cards to target when prices are falling if we don't want to lose too much in the future? And so there's a strategy that I like to use here, which is to basically find cards that are near or even below their previous all-time high before the market went on a huge boom. To me, cards that have already reached a level that have then subsequently fallen either below that level or remain around that level that wasn't as a result of the hype of the last few months, that says to me that that's more likely to be genuine demand, and those are likely to be safer cards that are likely to fall less in the near future. So let me actually start by showing you the opposite of what I mean so we can see what types of profiles we probably don't want to buy right now. So let's take this Monkey D. Luffy Bandai Card Fest 2024/2025 card, for example. So if we look at the chart, about a year ago, this card was $11. I actually picked up this card for between $4 and $5 a little over a year ago. And this card subsequently rose to over $164. Now you can have it for around $72. So on the one hand, you might say, well, this used to be a $165 card. Now it's less than half that. This has to be a great buy, right? My answer to that question is maybe. I don't know. The card used to be $4 or $5. A year ago, it was less than $12. So in terms of evaluating what this card should be worth, I'm very confident it's worth somewhere between $165 and $4. But beyond that, it's really difficult to know where this card is going to fall. And so I view, even though this has fallen 50% already, buying this card at, $72 is pretty risky because this card could easily fall back to $15 if the demand isn't genuine for this card, which is really hard to know. Of course, if you really like the card, if you want it in your collection, if this is a price that you're happy to pay, if you don't mind the price going down, of course, you should purchase it. But I just want to let people know that I think when there is an incredibly wide delta between what people were willing to pay before the boom and what the price is right now, that's a risky card to buy, one that may continue to fall much further in the future. All right, so now let's talk about something more positive. Let's talk about cards that are actually potentially safer buys in this market. The first, I'm showing the Nami Gold Dawn here, but I actually think this applies to a lot of the Dawn, with the exception of maybe the Zoro, because that one did go up a lot over the last few weeks. But if we look, when this one came out, this was around $220, and now you can have it for a little less than $200. That's not a huge difference, and obviously there's a hype associated with the set coming out, so I don't want to suggest that all-time highs necessarily mean that that's what this card is going to cost in the future. But if you look at the all-time low for the card, it was still only $183, and we're not that far above that. As we previously covered about PRBO1, these Gold Dawn are pretty rare. I haven't looked at PRBO2 yet, but I suspect that they're likely to be rare here as well. So if this is a card that you really like, I think, this is a reasonably safe card to buy in this time, or at least the numbers indicate that we've never seen it fall far below this price, and people have been willing to pay more for it, which I view as, a relative indication of safety. Next up, we have another Nami card. This is the OP5 Nami leader card. So at its previous peak, this card was around $232 about a year ago. You can currently buy it for around $250. Obviously, that's still a little bit above where the peak for this card was. But given that this card actually came out several years ago, the fact that it was $230 a year ago shows that there's sort of sustained demand at that price. I think this is probably a reasonably safe buy if you like this card and if you want it in your collection. Again, the all-time low was around $137, which obviously is far below $250, but again, is sort of within the normal range of how cards rise and fall over time. This isn't like the first card we saw where it went from $5 to $170. So next up, if you're looking for something sealed, we have Starter Deck 1. This is the first ever starter deck that wasn't like a super pre-release deck. I'm pretty sure this just got a reprint. I know our local store just ended up putting out a whole bunch more, which I doubt they had just been saving. And I think seeing the prices fall indicate that there was likely a reprint. So I want to start by saying there's a lot of these out there, so I would not go crazy over these at all. But I think if you're looking to buy something sealed, and I think if you're looking to buy something that is original to the game, the original starter deck Luffy leader in this set is pretty cool. The fact that this is $27 when its previous high price was $26 a year ago, compared to the $50+ that this was selling for just a few weeks ago, I think this is a relatively safe buy. MSRP on these boxes when they came out were like $12, and even if it fell a little bit further, I think the risk on this box is pretty low, but I do think there's a little bit of upside given that it is the first set, even though there are a ton of these out there. The next card I want to talk about is the Alt Art Secret from Emperors in the New World. So I'm actually a huge fan of this card. I think the art on this is super, super cool. Obviously, I'm on the record for saying that I really like OP09 as a set. This card currently is around $29. At its previous high, a little less than a year ago, this was $41. And its peak a few weeks ago, this was $64-ish. So I think at significantly below what its all-time high was before the run-up, this strikes me as a pretty good value. Again, I wouldn't go crazy on this card because there's a lot of OP09 out there. I haven't exactly run the numbers yet, but I suspect that there's quite a lot, and it's not an incredibly rare card, but I do think that the art is really, really cool. So I think if you like this card, I think at this price, this is a pretty reasonable price to buy, that it's hard to imagine it falls wildly more in the future. At its bottom, this was around $15. That strikes me as too low, frankly. But again, even if it fell all the way back to that price, the likelihood that you lose a lot is pretty small given how cheap the card is. So this is one that if I didn't already have, I would probably pick up. Next, we have the Linlin SP from OP06. Obviously, I spent a lot of time on this channel talking about Luffy's and Nami's and Boas and Zoros and like the most popular cards. So I really wanted to highlight a card that I think is really fun, but isn't one of the most popular characters. So here we have Big Mom Charlotte Linlin. This is the SP from OP06. At its peak previously, this card was, over $100. And now can be had for $78. Playability matters when we look at previous all-time highs for these prices. So this being over $100 was not entirely collector driven, so we want to be upfront about that. But I do think that, if you compare it to the other sort of like B, C, D tier SPs, this is still relatively affordable compared to a lot of those other ones. And I think the art on this one is just so fun. That if you like it, I think this is somewhat of a reasonable price to pay. I think the lowest we've seen any SP go for at this point is like, $40 or $50. So again, I think the downside on this card is pretty low, especially considering like, I think this is a much better card than Flampe or the Borsalino or like some of the other lower value cards. Next up, we have the Yamato alt art from OP06. I really like this art, and this is one of the cards that I have actually overpaid for. I paid, I think, $125 for it, which, its previous high about a year ago was $98. Again, playability is relevant here, but I think this is mostly collector-driven prices. At this point, this card is less than its high was a year ago. It is significantly less than I paid for it like a year and a half ago. I'm a big fan of this art. I think it stands out among other leaders. So for that reason, I think if you feel the same, $90 is a pretty reasonable price to pay. It obviously could go down further. At its lowest, it was around $50. But again, we're talking about it being less than double its all-time low, which again strikes me as like fairly low risk compared to some other cards. Next up, we have the Luffy alt art from OP5. Now, obviously, we've talked about how great of a set OP5 is, how much I like Luffy leader cards. I think that they are likely to stand the test of time. I think leader cards in general are a little bit underrated by the market right now. But this is a card that at its peak a year ago was around $65. It went up to, around $120. I was on the record when this was around $100 as saying that I still thought this was pretty reasonable compared to other cards in the market. And now this is down to $70. So the fact that this is just a tiny bit above where it was a year ago, to me says that this is a pretty good deal and likely to be reasonably safe. This did drop to, $27 about 6 months ago, which again, the floor for these leader cards tend to be around, $15 to $20, with the better leaders usually going for more than that. So $26 feels like shockingly low. So I don't think we're ever going to go back to that price again. Possible that it continues to fall a little bit given that low price was significantly lower. But I feel like for a Luffy leader card from one of the most prestigious sets that we've ever had, $70 is pretty reasonable. And I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up being a relatively safe buy at this point. So next up, we have Premium Card Collection 6 Assortment Volume 1. I do not have this, so I don't know a ton about this one, but I will say that the cards in this set are really, really cool, particularly this Luffy here. Was trading for a very high amount for a long time. At its peak, this was around $260. Its all-time low was around $120 when this came out, and now you can buy it for $110. Again, this one's a bit tricky because we don't really know what the floor is, right? Given that it's currently at its all-time low, it could fall further, and we don't know what support would be to stop it from falling further, so take this with a grain of salt. But I think if you really like this card, I think this could be a potentially decent value because it's already dropped more than 50% below what its all-time low was when it was released during a period of lower hype. Next up, we have the Sanji parallel from Royal Blood. So for those who haven't gotten to this point in the story, the Straw Hats and some other folks end up switching bodies for a period of time. So this is actually Sanji trapped in Nami's body. It is very, very funny. And so this card brings me a lot of joy in just thinking about the story arc. But in terms of price, when this card first came out, this card was $60 at its peak. And then fell quite a bit. But if you look at the chart, this card is pretty much near its all-time low. This card, for whatever reason, didn't spike when most of the other cards did spike. I think probably because, people were hesitant to spend significant money on most of the alt arts. They really wanted to be in other categories of cards. But I think the fact that this is $19, it's very close to its all-time low. It never seemed to have like a hype-induced boom. And also, people had previously been willing to pay $60 for this, suggests to me that if you like this card, this is probably a pretty good purchase at this price. I think fans of the show are always going to appreciate cards from this arc. And I also think that this is just like a pretty nice Nami card if you are interested in Nami cards. So for all those reasons, I think this is a pretty good value at around $19. This is one that I don't have, so I probably will end up picking this up in the near future if it stays at this price. And then the last card I want to talk about is another Nami card. This is the O-Nami from OP6. So this alt art previously was around $27. It jumped up to over $70 for a while, and now it's back down to around $22. So, I don't think this is necessarily a screaming buy, but this card is trading below what you could have had it before the boom. And so any of those cards I typically view as being safer purchases than things that spiked a lot during the boom and haven't come all the way down to the bottom. And so for that reason, I think if you like this card, I think $22 is a pretty reasonable price to pay. So that's all I have for today. If you're finding this content helpful, if you enjoy it, please like, subscribe, comment. I love interacting with you all in the comments. As I said previously, I'm looking to do a video of commenter questions and answered in the future. So if you have questions, please hit me up in the comments. I'll do my best to respond there, but I'm also going to take some of them and try to make them into a video in the future. So with that, thanks so much for your time, and I will see you in the next one.